Hey, it's Noir Vortex, and I thought I'd just do another talking video really. This time on just a few things that have been going around my head, or are going around in my head at the minute. Um, Recurring themes actually, so I thought I'd talk about the pursuit of meaning, and I guess maybe a bit of about philosophical pessimism, even nihilism actually. I'm just reading in the minute a book called The Trouble of Being Born by Emil Cioran, which I'm finding a very riveting and interesting read. And it's full of these funny aphorisms about existence and just the sort of absurdity of existence, I guess. I mean, that's a key theme. And he's got I do like Cioran because I don't think everybody would really get into his writing, but I actually find it quite humorous in a way, and I love the way it's written. Got a certain lyricism in the writing. Um, I mean, I've not really written any philosophy myself for a long time, but I do appreciate his prose style and his. I mean, it's translated from French, I think, but or most of it's from French and Romanian, I think. But he's a very interesting writer, and it sort of got me thinking about all these sort of subjects again, I suppose. So meaning, I mean, so obviously I'm going to touch on existentialism and sort of that philosophical continental school, I guess, of which is the main philosophy school of philosophy, which has really explored this subject on a pretty deep level. I mean, it's pretty developed really as a sort of philosophical quest, as it were, to understand how we as human beings can create meaning in our lives, I guess. Obviously, the crisis of religion, with as Nietzsche predicted, the death of God and the death of the religious certainties, did create a void in the human spirit, maybe, I guess, of, if you want to put it in those terms, of because truth and meaning used to be handed down from an authority. It was very structured. There's a religious authority to it. So, in when Nietzsche predicted the death of God with the when it was in when he proclaimed that God was dead, as the idea of God, the religious certainties which he was, and he's predicted that would cause a crisis in human consciousness and with morality as well, because most of our morality, which is, I mean, when you really get down to the deep levels of it, I mean, morality is a system, it's a framework that we as human beings make, and we constantly reinvent and change. I mean, like the morality of civilizations thousands of years, like ancient Rome, even for example, even though that was an early civilizing force, Rome, it was in many respects barbaric. You had slavery, you had gladiatorial combat for criminals, you had but as times change, obviously these systems have evolved. And I guess when Nietzsche predicted the death of God, he didn't predict this as a good thing necessarily, but he spent the latter part of his writing career trying to define how humanity can move beyond that. And obviously his Übermensch idea was sort of creatively willed individual was his attempt at an answer of that, which essentially the Übermensch is somebody who rises above the herd, or like the moral majority, so the prevailing moral attitudes of the time, and they will develop their own self-created morality. It's a very complicated idea actually. I sometimes get it. There's some contradiction that you could argue maybe as well, like if yeah, I mean there's certain contradictions in the idea for sure. It's very complicated. I mean, Nietzsche's a very complicated thinker. Someone I've been meaning to read actually is Viktor Frankl, who was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. My therapist actually recommended it to me, and he was a survivor of the camps basically, and he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, which is something I need to pick up actually, just to get a sort of another view on this sort of whole thing. I mean, I think as individual beings, we're almost cursed to create our own meaning. I mean, I think I'm not really that familiar with Jean-Paul Sartre, but one of the things I understand with his existentialism is that, you know, it is a hard thing, but we have no choice but to make our choices and live with them and try and forge our path and whatever. I mean, he was quite influenced by Nietzsche, actually, Satre, and Camus is quite interesting too. I read The Myth of Sisyphus a while ago. Probably mispronounced that. I'm terrible at pronunciation, but Myth of Sisyphus, I think. So it starts off with a very interesting philosophical question, which is, why not just kill yourself? Like, why not? If existence has no meaning, then why wouldn't you just top yourself? I mean, because there's no meaning to it anyway, so you might as well just return to potentially like infinite nothing, the sort of pre-existence state of just non-existence, really. The way from what I remember from reading that book, because it was about 5 years ago I read it, is that his answer to this question was, so the myth of Sisyphus is a mythical tale about a man who he constantly pushes his rock up the top of a mountain and then it falls back down again, and then he just goes and does that infinitely, so like eternally. Nietzsche also had this idea of eternal recurrence, which is the idea that the existence that you live now, your life, you will have to live infinitely many times, and it'll keep on just returning to you like an Ouroboros, like a snake eating its own tail. So every decision you make is for life, it's for eternity actually, not even for life, it's eternity. So you will just live the same life again and again and again and again, which is obviously a terrifying prospect, because that means every mistake you make, and we all make those, and every thing you regret and every joy as well, though, but everything that you've done wrong in your life will return back to you, and you'll be stuck in that exact same place again, making those same mistakes infinitely, for eternity, just going back and back. So Nietzsche, the reason he did this was that as a sort of, I guess, thought exercise as a sort of self-empowering philosophy. Like, people often misinterpret Nietzsche as like a nihilist, which he isn't. He's sort of like almost like a self-help. And he's not really a self-help. He sort of is, actually. I mean, he's sort of an advanced scholarly self-help philosophy, really. His philosophy is a philosophy of self-improvement, of action. His philosophy with a hammer, like he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, or no, Twilight of the Idols, sorry, which I read about a year ago. It's like Twilight of the Idols is I read that I think a year and a half ago, and it's pretty bombastic and sort of a lot of zeal in it, but like a lot of Nietzsche, really. It's very sort of lyrically written and everything, and quite, yeah, like I said, in that book he talks about philosophy with a hammer, like smashing what you take for granted and constantly reassessing your values. So that's part of it as well, which is good, because I mean, if you are constantly reassessing everything, that's how do we evolve as human beings? We reassess our basic core fundamental values. That's a very philosophical. I mean, I guess you could say it's a sort of Socratic method you can do with any type of thinking, where you question base principles and then question those and question infinitely, regressively questioning things, which can obviously drive you a bit mad as well. But yeah, I mean, I think there's something to learn from Nietzsche. Emil Cioran, so I was talking about Emil Cioran earlier. He's like jet black pessimist, really, but they're really. I would recommend anyone who's ever read any Nietzsche to read Cioran, because he's bleak, but I find him humorous, quite honestly. Like I find this it's like a jet. So if you like black humor, there is a certain jet black humor that runs through his writing and his prose, which is very lyrical, which you'll certainly appreciate. And I actually get something out of his work. I find it sort of witty and also informative. Cioran actually talks a lot about religion. mostly about the futility of it, but he understands why it exists because, you know, and he talks about in what's it called again, History of Decay, one of his books. He basically talks about the cycling of civilizations and how civilizations rise but invariably fall. They all have these big ideals, but they all ultimately fail due to their own internal contradictions often. Well, that's at least how I, there's a line, I think there's a line he has which is, why bother making a girl unhappy, or why do anything? Like, he has a lot of that. Obviously, I'm just complete paraphrasing. It's much more lyrical and like interesting than what I just said then. But he has these like sort of very like very self-contained passages in his writing, which are I find hugely entertaining on some level, and also occasionally quite actually like some really sort of bleak in some ways, but it's philosophical pessimism, so it's not exactly like happy and like really positive. But then saying that, I mean, I've talked about this in a previous vlog I did. I don't think philosophical pessimism is necessarily a philosophy of negativity or nihilism. It doesn't have to be that. It can be something much more than that. It can be basically a framework for not getting too disappointed with the world, really, because I mean, the good thing about philosophical pessimism as a framework for ideas actually is you're not expecting that things will always get better. So I mean, obviously you have to have aims and goals in life. Going back to the meaning, that's a big part of my life. You have to create this sort of focus and this way you want to direct your energies, because potentially you are an eternal recurrent loop and you've only got one existence, and it's your brief flicker in a vastly complex system that we live in, which we'll probably never fully understand. We've tried to come up with systems of thought to explain it, God, or maybe consciousness is we have to try and attain nirvana in Buddhist philosophy, or we have to try and return to a sort of pure state in Christianity of pre-fall, sort of idealized state of humanity, or you're gonna get judged to heaven or hell based on your actions, la la la. So we've tried to deal with this question. It's obviously the biggest question in human existence, really. It's like, why are we here? And I mean, part of the beauty, I think, of philosophical pessimism, not nihilism because that's destructive, but philosophical pessimism it's a sort of very accepting philosophy of our limitations. It doesn't say that, it doesn't claim to have any big answers to those questions, and I think that's why I find it quite beneficial and that's why I still do consider myself a philosophical pessimist, because I mean, all the evidence suggests that we live in a chaotic. I mean, there is order in the universe, sure. Like there is order. I mean, like, I'm made of atoms. I have a structure. I have a mind. I have all these things are ordered. But I would recommend actually watching a video. I think it's by that Cousinet channel. I can't remember exactly. I'll try and link it below. But it basically charts the entire lifespan of the universe as we know it, scientifically what will happen. In terms of like the actual time that human beings will probably be around in the universe and be able to function, even on some level, I mean, the whole time of the universe is this. We're a blink in the eye of cosmos, and the entropy basically comes into play here. Entropy being the principle of systems. So everything tends towards disorder over a given amount of time. Enough time, everything breaks down, decays, all the rest of it. Sort of related to the history of decay thing, which is another reason why I like Cioran. He talks just very candidly about how, I guess, the sort of entropy metaphor, really. So yeah, I mean, like, the universe but basically, I mean, we're very brief, beautiful, admittedly. I mean, being a pessimist doesn't mean that you don't see the beauty in the world. It's more that you recognise how lucky we are really to be here, and how honoured, sort of. I think the real question of philosophy is coming to terms with the void. In a lot of ways, coming to terms. I'll call the video that actually. Coming to terms with the void. It really is that simple. That stark. I mean, I think a lot of philosophy is actually, in a lot of ways, a sort of flirtation with death, maybe a sort of exercise of contemplating non-existence, maybe. Phillip Mainlander is a very good philosopher as well. Actually, I've been really reading a bit recently. I read some of his Philosophy of Redemption, which I think is one of the only essays you can actually find online, because he wrote in German. He was German. Very sad story of Phillip Mainlander, actually. So he had a day job. I can't remember what he did for his day job, but something very boring, really. But he was a writer, and never really that successful in his time, but he was involved with I think a group of philosophers which included like Hegelians, I think the new Hegelians or something, and his philosophy concerns, one of the key ideas in his philosophy is the idea that God basically killed itself to create the universe. So basically going from a structure and breaking itself down. That's one of his key ideas in his philosophy, is the idea that out of a destructive act became order for a while, which is like one of his key metaphysics in Phillip Mainlander's philosophy. But Mainlander actually killed himself. Wasn't very old. I think he was maybe 37. I can't remember exactly, but he's pretty young, and he I think it's very sad, because I think in a lot of ways he saw something very stark and dark in his work, and he sort of took it to a horrible logical conclusion by taking his own life. I think there's something very human and very sad about that, really, about how someone can really, really peer so deeply into the nature of reality as they see it, that they can sort of, be consumed by it. So that's probably one of the dangers of philosophical pessimism, certainly nihilism, nihilistic philosophy. Because Mainland is sort of considered a bit of a nihilist as well. But you do have to keep your sort of, be a bit based in reality, because if you go too deep, if you take the black pill basically too much, then you can really drown in those waters, really, to be honest. Like I'm not talking about a black pill in terms of I mean it in the sense of really taking like the nihilism black pill. I don't mean it I know it's used in sort of like incel forums or whatever. That's not really the context I'm using it in. It's more generally used as a meme to describe nihilistic philosophy and that sort of thing. Mainlander's probably worth looking into if you're interested in looking into like historical philosophical nihilist philosophers. There's some really good videos on Mainlander, actually, which you can find pretty easily if you just type in Phillip Mainlander. He was also interesting in the sense that he was a socialist too. So he had a sort of idealized vision of what the world could be, with some sort of socialistic framework. But he's also a philosophical pessimist, which is quite a unusual mix. I mean, obviously Marx thought that he was basing all his ideas on material conditions, a materialist philosophy. But Phillip Mainlander, I lost my train of thought there. But Mainlander has this interesting metaphysics with the whole God that killed itself to make the universe, basically, which I find endlessly interesting idea. He talks a lot about, I need to read more about the Philosophy of Redemption, but he does talk about religion a lot. So it's interesting that these sort of atheistic philosophers take it so seriously, because I think you have to, really. because it has been the prevailing moral authority for thousands of years, really. It's been a civilizing force in some ways, but the key question for, I think, philosophy going forward is like post-religion world, which we are probably emerging into now. What will be the framework for how we construct a new morality and a system that gives our lives a meaning, basically, without sort of falling into this nihilistic trap of, well, nothing means anything, so why bother, or which is very fair, really. I think that's not really rising to the challenge of what Nietzsche saw, what Emil Cioran probably felt, and what Mainlander sort of sacrificed himself for, unfortunately, sadly. So I think I'll end this video here. I think I'm pretty happy with that, actually, like a nice little stream of consciousness. And I'll say bye. I'm going to use this channel a lot more, just for sort of like, I want to do these little experiments where I have a sort of just riff and just think of an idea and just riff on it. If you've got any suggestions for other topics you'd like to see me talk about, that'd be interesting for me to get some ideas. I'd really like to use this a bit more, just to talk sometimes, every now and again anyway, and just reel off have some interesting thinking time, really. So with that, I'll say Loire Vortex, and that was interesting on some level. It's like 20 minutes, it's quite long, so in a bit.